The Density Divide, Urbanization, Polarization, and Populist Backlash by Will Wilkinson, Vice President for Research at the Niskanen Center. Introduction. The great gradual migration of the human population from the countryside to the city has transformed the human world, but we've barely begun to reckon with its political implications. What will be remembered about the 21st century more than anything else, writes Doug Saunders in his book Arrival City, is the great and final shift of human populations out of rural agricultural life and into cities. Suppose that this great shift has, over generations, sorted us on the traits, ethnicity, education level, personal temperament, that draws us toward cities or keeps us away. What would the cultural and spatial segregation produced by ongoing selective urbanization mean for the cohesion of our society and the health of the American Republic? Declining public faith in democracy and the rising global tide of populist nationalism have kindled a widespread and mounting sense of dread that the liberal order is unraveling. Here in the United States, there is a roiling debate about the forces that allowed a dangerously corrupt and compromised populist demagogue to capture the Republican Party and then the White House. What explains the presidency of Donald Trump? Economic anxiety? A loss of faith in elites? Aggravation over political correctness? Backlash to immigration, demographic change, and evolving national identity? In this paper, I explore a neglected hypothesis for the crisis facing liberal democracy, one centered on the economic, political, and cultural implications of urbanization, the most momentously transformative trend in the organization of human social life over the past 2 centuries. Urbanization, I argue, has sorted and segregated national populations and concentrated economic production in megacities, driving us further apart, culturally, economically, and politically, along the lines of ethnicity, education, and population density. I call this rift the density divide. America's constitutional structure, I contend, is poorly equipped to handle the density divide. Understanding the forces behind the growth of this fissure is critical to understanding the rise of populism around the world and to answering the why Trump question here in the United States, where the maladaptation of our political institutions to the polarizing pressures of the density divide has bred intensifying mutual contempt and has brought us to the brink of a destabilizing crisis of democratic legitimacy. Summary of the argument. The basic story is that urbanization is a mechanism that sorts the population on attributes that make individuals more or less responsive to the incentives to urbanize. Ethnicity, education, and personality stand out in importance in this regard. The upshot of this process of selection is that over time, the non-urbanized population has grown more homogeneously white and conservative as the population at large has filtered toward big cities. Meanwhile, changes in the technical structure of the economy have increased the productivity and wage bonuses to higher education, as well as the geographic concentration of talent. This has amplified incentives to get more schooling and move to thriving big cities, concentrating human capital and economic opportunity and output in dense metro areas. Smaller towns, rural areas, and cities with an outdated mix of industries have been left with economic stagnation or decline. The increase in returns to human capital and density has amplified the polarizing nature of selective urbanization. It's intensified the self-selection of temperamentally liberal individuals into higher education in big cities, while leaving behind a lower density population that's relatively uniform in white ethnicity, conservative disposition, and lower economic productivity. That spatial sorting by itself should be expected to widen the values gap between city and country people, but we should expect urban-rural economic divergence to intensify this polarizing effect. Economic growth reliably generates liberalizing cultural change, shifting people toward more progressive, self-expression social values, whatever their native ideological temperaments. Conversely, stagnant or declining material prospects tend to generate a rising sense of anxiety and threat, leading people to adopt a zero-sum us or them frame of mind. The concentration of economic growth in relatively big cities accordingly concentrates the liberalizing treatment effect of rising living standards on the already relatively liberal urban population, while rural stagnation is widening the already significant gap in cultural and moral values produced by the increasing spatial separation of urbanizers and rooted holdouts. Diversity does not breed distrust, but spatial segregation does. Moreover, spatial segregation along ideological and values lines is itself radicalizing. A lack of exposure to intellectual diversity pushes people's views to extremes. The urban population is much more diverse in terms of both its ethnocultural and temperamental composition, which helps explain why the more homogeneous non-urban population has shifted toward the right extreme faster. Taken together with polarizing media fragmentation and immigration-led demographic change, this is a formula for populist ethno-nationalist reaction in lower-density populations. Because urbanization is a worldwide phenomenon, we should not be surprised to see a similar story playing out around the globe. As a matter of fact, support for Brexit in the UK and for ethno-nationalist populist parties in France and Germany, like the Front National and the Alternative for Deutschland, was notably higher among less diverse, less educated, lower-density populations. The exact political consequences of polarizing spatial sorting depend in large part on the structure of a country's democratic institutions. In the American system, which practically guarantees a two-party equilibrium and overrepresents low-density populations, polarization along the density divide can be a recipe for disaster. America's major parties have now split relatively cleanly along density and ethnicity lines. This division, combined with the density penalties in the American electoral system, explains how it was possible for a white nationalist to get into the White House with a third of the economy and less than half of the vote. Part 1. The Political Economy of the Density Divide. Imagine a tabletop evenly scattered with a mix of iron, nickel, steel, and aluminum ball bearings. Now, suppose we were to place an electromagnet at the center of the table. If we begin at a low level of power, the magnet will draw the nearest and most magnetic metals toward it. As we progressively turn up the attractive magnetic force, more and more of the iron, nickel, and steel will migrate toward the center of the table and create a growing, densely packed, multi-metallic cluster around the magnet. Aluminum, however, is non-magnetic. The aluminum bearings may get jostled by other migrating metals and possibly even nudged a fair distance toward the increasingly magnetic cluster carried along by the general drift of migration. But they will otherwise mostly stay put, spread relatively evenly over the surface of the table. It's a simple analogy, but it helps us envision the process by which urbanization, operating over a vast space for multiple centuries, has split the American electorate along the lines of population density. The depopulation of the countryside reflects the fact that cities are magnets for people seeking opportunity, and their gradually increasing attractive force has slowly separated our population into two factions. One, a diverse, densely concentrated magnetic faction, and two, a homogeneous, sparsely distributed, non-magnetic faction. The logic of America's electoral institutions, our first-past-the-post, winner-take-all electoral system, has always sorted the bulk of American voters into one of two major parties. What's new is that the sorting dynamic of urbanization now accounts for partisan sorting, too. Democrats have become the party of the multicultural city, Republicans the party of the monocultural exurbs country, the party of relatively urbanization-resistant white people. This pattern didn't suddenly crop up. It's been long in the making, but the density divide has only recently sharpened to the point at which it could become a dominant factor in electoral politics. Population density and party vote share. In the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump prevailed in 80% of America's counties. That's 2,584 of 3,056. But those counties contain just 45% of the country's population. Hillary Clinton dominated Trump in dense metro regions of over 1 million people, where 56% of the population lives. That's how she managed to rack up a 2.9 million popular vote advantage while winning just 472, that's just 1 in 5, counties. Now, this is a significant shift towards regional polarization since 2000, when Al Gore's 659 counties netted him a narrower popular vote victory. Low-density counties are relatively ethnically homogenous. They contain more than half, 56%, of the white population, but just 20% of the nation's foreign-born population. Likewise, fewer than 1 in 5 Asians and 1 in 3 Hispanics live in Trump counties. Immigrants and minorities congregate in big cities, attracted by the opportunities, service, sense of community, inclusion, and safety in numbers they supply. Economic output and party vote share. The economic dimension of the divide is equally stark. The 462 Clinton counties also accounted for 64% of GDP, nearly twice the combined economic output of the 2,548 counties that favored Trump. This represents a dramatic shift since 2000 as well, when the 659 counties that went for Gore produced 54% of GDP compared to 46% generated by the 2,397 Bush counties. Economic productivity has become increasingly correlated with both education and population density, but also between places with more or less dense agglomerations of those workers. As smaller, less educated cities and towns languish, their best-schooled daughters and sons decamp to the metropolis, further widening the big city, small town productivity and employment gap. There has been, in the words of Mark Muro and Jacob Whiten of the Brookings Institution, quote, a truly eye-popping divergence of big, medium, small-sized communities' growth progress. One that's getting worse. They report, the 53 very largest metro areas, those with populations over 1 million residents, have accounted for fully 93.3% of the nation's population growth since the crisis, but an incredible 96.4% of it since 2014, though they account for just 56% of the overall population. Even more significantly, the biggest metros generated fully 2/3 of output growth on the economic front and 73% of employment gains between 2010 and 2016. This concentration of growth and opportunity, they note, has recently intensified. Since 2014, million-plus metros produced a whopping 72% of America's output growth and 74% of the country's employment gains. Over generations, the escalating incentive to seek education and move to the city has filtered those most responsive to these inducements and least wary of urban diversity out of lower-density America. This has left the places they've fled poorer and less educated, and the people who remain in those places almost uniformly white, averse to dynamic multicultural cities, alarmed by the prospect of majority-minority America, and receptive to pandering demagogic explanations of their relative decline. This has left the places they've fled poorer and less educated, and the people who remain in them almost uniformly white, averse to dynamic multicultural cities, alarmed by the prospect of a majority-minority America, and receptive to pandering demagogic explanations of their relative decline. There are no Republican cities. This sorting process has progressed to the point that there is now no such thing as a Republican city. Quote, as you go from the center of cities out through the suburbs and into rural areas, you traverse in a linear fashion from Democratic to Republican places, Stanford political scientist Jonathan Rodden has observed. The electorate is typically equal parts Democrat and Republican at about 900 people per square mile, according to Mark Muro of the Brookings Institution. The exact number varies a bit from place to place, higher in more Republican and lower in more Democratic states. But overall, majorities tend to flip from blue to red, roughly where commuter suburbs gives way to exurban sprawl. That's where the political boundary of the density divide is drawn. Higher population density predicts higher Democratic vote share, even in small cities, in deep red counties, in deep red states. Rodden has shown heavy concentrations of Democratic voters in the relatively dense historic cores of most small and mid-sized cities, such as Scranton, Pennsylvania, or Terre Haute, Indiana. These concentrations wash out with distance from City Hall. Quote, there is a fascinating fractal-like relationship between population density, which is the upshot of early industrial activity, and Democratic voting, Rodden writes. Quote, As one zooms in to lower and lower levels of geographic aggregation, the relationship only reappears in finer detail." Unquote. This pattern holds even in Marshalltown, Iowa, my childhood hometown of about 27,000 people. A dynamic map from the New York Times, which allows users to zoom into any region of the United States and see 2016 election results at the precinct level, shows that in Marshalltown, Hillary Clinton won majorities in the densest part of town and earned a whopping 72% of the vote in the oldest, densest precinct, enough to eke out a majority in this seat of a rural Trump county in a rural state that the president took by a pretty wide margin. The point here is that there are no red states or blue states. There aren't even red or blue counties. What we see is compact blue urban density and sprawling red sparseness, even in small cities in rural states. The density divide sharpened further in the 2018 midterm elections, which saw Democrats take the majority of the seats in the House of Representatives by capturing even more of the relatively high-density suburbs, leaving the GOP with an even lower-density constituency. CityLab's Congressional Density Index breaks down each congressional district's mix of neighborhoods along a continuum of population density that runs from pure urban to urban-suburban mix to dense suburban to sparse suburban to rural suburban mix to pure rural, which includes the countryside, small towns, and some suburb-like areas. In the 116th Congress, Republicans hold just 6% of pure urban districts, in which only 14% of the electorate voted for Trump. But they hold 82% of rural-suburban mixed districts, that's 56% Trump voters, and 84% of pure rural districts, 63% Trump voters. The division of Republican and Democratic areas in terms of economic productivity also remained stark in the 2018 midterm elections. House districts won by Democrats accounted for 60.9% of 2016 GDP, while Republican districts accounted for just 37.6%. This disparity reflects a gap in education and output per worker. Slightly more than 35% of the population in Democratic districts had a college or graduate degree, compared to 28% in Republican districts, which corresponds to a nearly $25,000 annual advantage in GDP which corresponds to a nearly $25,000 annual advantage in GDP per worker in Democrat-held House districts. However, Republicans gained ground in the Senate, heightening the mismatch between regional economic output, fiscal contribution, and political representation. As Muro and Whiten write, quote, "With new GOP gains in the chamber, 21 mostly rural low-output states ranging from Arkansas to Wyoming now host 2 Republican senators and are poised to serve as an even more reactionary veto on the projects and priorities of the high-output America. These 21 states will easily be able to outvote the 19 states with 2 Democratic senators, even though the Republican 21-state caucus represents just 30.3% of the nation's output," unquote.